Hello and welcome to today's ISTAT Learning Lab. The topic today is air cargo resurgence in 2024, trends and sustainability of the industry's growth. To talk about this, we have in our studio in Seattle, Tom Crabtree, who is the Managing Director of Trade and Transport Group. That's a strategy consulting firm to companies operating in the global transportation and logistics space. This company also manages Trade and Data Service, which is a global trade analysis site. So Tom has deep experience in cargo market analysis, forecasting, and developing fleet plans and financial projections for both established and startup carriers across the globe. He's a recognized authority on the state of commercial as well as military cargo markets. Before joining a Trade and Transport Group last year, Tom was a regional director, airline and market analysis for Boeing commercial airplanes in Seattle. This is a position that he held for over 25 years and responsible for air cargo industry issues. From 2000 to 2020, Tom was the chief editor of Boeing World Air Cargo Forecast. And his expertise on commercial and cargo market trends and military airlift has played a key role in Boeing's product strategy and product development efforts. Tom began his professional career with Boeing in 1991. He held positions in sales support, engineering, flight operations, engineering, and marketing. And Tom holds a Bachelor of Science degree in aerospace engineering and also an MBA from University of Kansas. And he has received a certificate in Russian technical language translation from Novosibirsk State University. Before I hand over to Tom, I just want to say that during Tom's presentation, you can write in questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And I will monitor those questions coming in. And then when Tom is finished, I'm going to go over those with Tom to the extent that we have time. So with that, I want to hand over the microphone to Tom Crabtree from Trade and Transport Group.
Thank you, Niels, for that introduction. Really appreciate it. Niels and I have worked together for a long time. Niels, before you go completely away, at least verbally, you'll recall that I think we met in person in Luxembourg in 2003 at a Boeing-hosted, Cargolux co-hosted event called the Cargo Air Transport Symposium. Do you recall that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So just a full disclosure, Niels and I know each other from a long time ago. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those of you who may be based in Asia that are trepidate enough to join today. Thank you so much for joining. Air cargo traffic declined back in 2022 a substantial amount, about 8% after coming off the big boom in 2021 as the world started to unravel the supply chain crisis that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Cargo traffic declined a further 1.8%. in 2023 beyond 2022 levels. But I will point out that the decline was actually predicted by a number of authorities to be much more severe last year, somewhere between 4 and 5% beyond the 8% decline in 2021. But we're seeing a recovery that started probably in the third quarter of last calendar year in 2023, and it continues today. And as some of you may have seen, IATA has already reported earlier today their numbers for the month of March, which are the fourth consecutive month of year-over-year double-digit growth. But not all is well in the air cargo industry, and let's talk about that. I want to talk about sustainability with respect to this learning lab. Sustainability means what's driving the current recovery and what's missing in the current recovery. So let me get to it. Now, I've got a number of slides that are a visual assault of significant magnitude, I will have to confess. The first 5 or so slides are based on region-to-region flows internationally, based on IATA monthly statistics data. We're going to look both at passenger traffic, passenger capacity, cargo traffic, and cargo capacity. Then we're going to pivot to 4 slides that look at the same cargo and traffic capacity figures, but by region of airline domicile. So, and then we'll talk a little bit more about our predictions of what's going to unfold in the next 5 years. And then we'll get into a bit of freighter fleet discussion and rates. What are the current pricing rates and what's driving them for freight transportation, not only air, but more importantly, to a big degree, what's happening in the container ship industry. So we got a lot of ground to cover. For those of you who are counting down to the bitter end, I've got 30 visuals up here, but I'll be very, very quick and I'll explain any axes. Niels, please interject if people have questions and something wasn't clear. So let's take a look at passenger traffic. Sorry, say again, Niels?
I think we'll try to keep the questions to the end unless there's something that is really the slide.
Okay. So passenger traffic, the numbers are spectacular in terms of region to region growth. I've focused on 6 regions in particular in flow and then basically bucketed everything into other. Now, I want you to take a look at this slide because traffic is back as we're still recovering, but you might notice that the numbers still are not hitting the peaks that we saw during the full year prior to the onset of the pandemic in 2019. So pivoting to capacity, you can kind of see the same sort of pattern, but let's take out the other. I want to focus on that momentarily. Look at some of the bigger region-to-region flows. Now, intra-Far East, still down, the dark green. The light green is the Trans-Pacific market. Notice that capacity still is not restored. This is passenger capacity. Therefore, the belly capacity, the passenger belly capacity necessary for freight transportation sustainment is simply not there. Same for Europe to and from the Middle East in that blue portion of this particular visual. Europe to and from North America is more or less restored. But those 2 big markets, the Europe Far East to and from North America and Europe to and from Far East are still heavily dependent on freighter capacity. But if we pivot to some very boring slides, and you'll notice that all these numbers are still very strong. Let's go to cargo. There's not a lot going on in cargo that meets the eye here that looks like that there's been a downturn, a sustained downturn of around 18 months from early 2022 to mid 2023. However, the numbers are coming back year over year very strong. There you'll notice in the right-hand column, that's the key message year to date and year over year. Then if we take a look at capacity, ditto, not much going on there. So what's the difference between the passenger visual and the cargo visuals, you might ask, Tom? Well, here's the deal. Those cargo capacity numbers are still relatively strong compared to pre-COVID levels, but the freighters are working much harder than they did 5 years ago at this time to meet demand. That's the key thing. Why is that? Well, on the Trans-Pacific, here's what's going on. The restoration of belly capacity, particularly between China and the United States, is largely incomplete in terms of restoration. There were 150 weekly wide-body passenger service sectors being flown in 2019. It is hoped for by the end of this year we'll be at 50. So only maybe we're still less than a third of restoration over the Pacific. The closure of Russian and Ukrainian airspace between Europe and Asia have basically curbed the belly capacity between those 2 regions. And the reason that the PRC, or People's Republic of China, and US and Canadian restorations, the sectors for restoration haven't really been fully implemented, is the disagreement between the governments of China and Russia and Canada over China's backing of Russia and the Ukraine war, as well as the inability of big carriers from the US and Canadian side to access Russian airspace to serve Chinese destinations. So the relative share probably of support from the freighter side will remain fairly strong for the foreseeable future. How long is an open question. Now I'm going to pivot real quick to passenger traffic by region of airline domicile. And notice that you can see, of course, that it was fairly boring up until the virus, a very small incremental growth rate, but still sustainable. Then a very big collapse, and then a restoration of traffic since early 2021. Please note the dark blue portion of the bar, particularly in the more recent months, starting at the beginning of 2023. That's mostly PRC domiciled carriers restoring service after the lifting of access to PRC at the end of December 2022 by the Chinese government. And the capacity visual doesn't look much different. Now, let's talk about cargo. Cargo, you'll notice, is much more volatile. And you can see the current recovery began towards, again, the end of third quarter last year, and has picked up steam into the first 2 months of 2024. And with the IATA announcement about an hour and a half, 2 hours ago, that March traffic came in excess of 10%. That was a fourth month of double-digit growth for the market, off an admittedly weak base. But we can talk. We'll talk more about what drove that momentarily. Look at capacity, very similar situation. And again, notice the dark blue portion of the bar is driving a lot of the recent and more recent months are driving. That is the Asia Pacific restoration of capacity is driving a lot of the recovery today. And if we look at top 20 carriers, and I apologize for this eye visual, it's very difficult to see, but there's a few points I want to make here. This is full year 2023 versus 2022 growth in terms of cargo ton kilometers flown. And you'll notice that FedEx and UPS have very weak numbers through the end of last year. Same for a handful of bigger carriers, but notice that the relative weakness is in two of the top three biggest carriers in the world. If we look at what's gone on in the first 2 months of the year for the same thing, FedEx and UPS are either their numbers are getting less negative or they've turned a corner in the case of FedEx and they're turning positive. But look at the relative strength of China domiciled airlines. Notice that China Southern, China Eastern, and particularly China Eastern down towards the bottom of the table, nearly 134% growth in the first 2 months of this year versus 2 months of last year. What's driving that? Let's say right now, you could say in 2 words, Temu and Shein. The e-commerce startups, they're relatively new compared to more established carriers like Alibaba or Amazon, are basically driving a charter market that is just super hot right now. And as a consequence, that is driving a lot of numbers in the positive direction. What is concerning is the missing, and this is kind of an interesting statistic. This comes from Cargofax Consulting. About 20% of total world air cargo traffic is linked to e-com. Where does the other 80% come from? In my research in my days at Boeing and at Trade and Transport Group, somewhere around 60 to 70% of world air cargo traffic is dependent upon world manufacturing and industrial activity. And it's an industrial support mechanism. And a lot of the world's industrial base is still weak coming out of the post-COVID recovery and the supply chain challenges that firms continue to face to this day. So that is where we bring in the sustainability. How sustainable is this recovery? And if the world industrial economy does not recover, particularly in Europe, and to a degree in parts of Asia, and to a lesser degree in parts of North America, that is cause for concern. So our forecast is tempered by that concern. We are predicting that growth this year will be a fairly strong 10% over about a 2% decline last year. And then basically the growth rate moderates to about a long-term growth rate of a little less than 3% through the end of 2028. Now I'm going to pivot to my favorite topic, that is the world's freighter fleet. I'm not going to read this entire slide to you, other than to say that we look at the world in 3 buckets. Narrow body freighters, that is those machines that carry up to 40 metric tons of useful payload. Medium wide bodies, those are machines that carry between 40 and 80 metric tons. And large wide bodies, anything that carries more than 80 metric tons. And going back to give you some examples, right now, The new up-and-coming players in the narrow-body sector are 737NGs and A321s. Medium-wide bodies, that is the arena between the 767, both production and conversions, as well as A330 conversion freighters, which are coming on very strong as of late, and large wide bodies, which is a sector that has been long dominated by the Boeing 747, historically the MD-11, and more recently the 777. I'll talk more about that, but we have a number of new entrants into that market, the Airbus A350, and no less than 3 conversions of 777, 300ER, 200LR, 3 firms in the non-OEM PDEF conversion space chasing conversions of older Boeing 777 passenger aircraft. Now, the world freighter fleet over the last 33 or so years basically looked fairly stagnant, but that belies the fact that it grew via gauge in both medium wide body and large wide body units. The standard body fleet contracted for basically about 15 years running, starting in the late 1990s up to about 2013, and has only resumed growth since the last decade or so. And basically, the freighter fleet has expanded about 4% per year since 2013. You can see the relative numbers of units in the donut chart at right. Let's dive a little deeper into what that looks like. Narrow body fleet was growing fairly well before the pandemic, but you'll notice that the 737NGs, driven by a number of lessors looking to place idle 737, particularly 800s, into freighter service during the dark days of 2020 and 2021 in the COVID-19 pandemic, basically drove a very red hot market that has cooled substantially since the end of 2022. And that is a market that's grown, but what's also coming on very strong, but to a lesser degree, are conversions of A321s and just a very small handful of A320 aircraft. What we're also seeing is an idling of older, less efficient capacity, and I'll talk more about that momentarily. Take a look at the medium wide bodies. Let me pivot back real quick to the narrow bodies. I want to say one thing here. If there's one market where the word overcapacity could be used, it's probably this one, but I don't know about the rest of you, but if you follow, say, Cerium or CH Aviation, there's not a day that goes by that I don't see an article about a new startup flying narrow body freighters that I've never heard of before. So there is opportunity out there. There's also risk. Let's just be quite honest with, quite blunt with that observation. When I'm going back to medium wide bodies, this is a sector that was long dominated by the A300, A310, but the 76 has kind of taken over leadership. But those days might be ceding somewhat to the A330 in the near future. And you can see the relative numbers of A330s have come on strong in just the last few years. Now to my favorite sector, the large wide body fleet. This is a sector that has seen a lot of neglect, in my opinion. It's grown by a very modest 140 units, mostly via the 777 fleet being grown. That is production 777s from Boeing. The MD-11 fleet, which has been out of production for, last one was built in 2001. So it's been out of production for nigh on 23 years. Those numbers are really starting to dwindle. In fact, the MD-11 numbers just since the end of last year have dwindled quite a few units, which I'll show you momentarily in terms of active service as of the end of March 2024. One of the big things we're watching for right here in this particular sector is that the number of 777 production freighters on order and to be delivered will likely overtake the number of 747 freighters in active service sometime between the next 12 and 24 months. That'll be somewhat seismic given the fact that the 47 has been the bellwether of the large wide-body fleet since the first one was delivered in March of 1972. I want to look at something that a lot of analysts don't look at, and that is the stored freighter fleet. Because basically whenever there is a time of weakness in air cargo traffic growth, the older, less efficient capacity gets put out to pasture. It basically is idled and in many cases retired. So what you're seeing here in the darker blue bar in the particular, the visual left is the idling of the 727 fleet, which was the bedrock of integrator express networks like FedEx, UPS, DHL back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And after the dot-com bubble burst and the 2000-2001 global recession struck, those ships didn't come back. And eventually they were permanently removed from service. Medium wide bodies, those are the reductions of older DC-10 and A300B4s over time. And then you can kind of see in the dark green portion, it took a while for the older 47s to be retired, and those really came on strong during the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Kind of interesting statistic. At the end of 2006, there were about 170 747 first generation freighters, 747-200s, both production and converted units. By the end of 2013, those numbers had dropped to about 25 747s in service. There are still a handful actually still out there flying. But I want to point out that the large wide body fleet really still was under a lot of pressure, given the fact there was a period of time where there was essentially no growth from 2011 through the end of 2013. I call it the great stagnation in air cargo. And what happened was a lot of older 47s, including 747-400s that had just been converted a few years prior, were withdrawn from service, their engines removed and basically used for green time, and the airframe scrapped. And those numbers now are being led by the MD-11. And you can kind of see that just the parked wide body fleet for the large wide bodies. Notice the relative increase in the purple there for the MD-11 and the bars, and notice that it is 31 units as it stood at the end of 2023. So that's what we're going through right now, is kind of a modernization of the large wide body fleet, which is, in my opinion, sorely overdue. The dependency on freighters. Let's talk about that momentarily. The folks at IATA produced this chart of the week in mid-February, so just a little over 2 months ago. I apologize if it doesn't come through very clearly on the Zoom presentation today, but the key point is that freighters have maintained a relatively strong share beyond pre-COVID norms on two major sectors. And again, that's Asia to and from North America and Asia to and from Europe. The rest of the world tends to be tracking more towards a pre-COVID norm. And our prediction is that at least through the end of this year, the share of cargo traffic carried by freighters will remain at a historic high above 55, but probably below 60%, which pre-COVID, that number was in the low 50s. By anybody's measure, both at Boeing, the Cargofax Consulting, and IATA all got very similar numbers within what we'll call hair's breadth distance, but it was very similar. So you can get an idea of what's going on out there, and it's kind of fascinating too. And for those of you who've heard me chat before, freighter dependency. Why do we care about it? Well, it's a niche industry within air transport. It's a niche industry within freight transportation in general on a global scale. But there are, say, 25,000 jet transports in the world, and these are 2019 numbers. Less than 10% were freighters. And that number really hasn't changed a lot, although it has come up for the freighters to a degree, but it's still less than 10%. So think about this. More than half of the world's air cargo traffic is measured in metric tons in plane multiplied by distance flown. We call them cargo 10 kilometers at Trade and Transport Group, as well as does IATA. Basically, more than half of the world's CTK traffic is controlled by freighters, and the remaining jet transports out there, mostly PAX wide bodies, passenger wide bodies, bring up the balance, and we're talking numbers in excess of 20,000. So, or I should say, in the case of wide bodies, probably closer to about 5,000 units in service worldwide. So the freighter fleet is a very pivotal part of our everyday lives. We just don't see it, except when we think about e-commerce from time to time. Now, what's happened to the world freighter fleet in the intervening 3 months? This chart is kind of telling. These 10 types in aggregation represent in excess of 90% of the freighters that are in service today. And I think I mentioned earlier that the weaker capacity during times of downturn gets withdrawn from service. Notice the increase in 757s, 737, 300, 400 freighters being idle, to a much lesser degree, A300s. A300 600 freighter is arguably a workhorse that has been very successful for its operators and for Airbus. The numbers that have been withdrawn or have been idle are fairly small. But the MD-11, look at the increase in the number of idle units, 40 units out of 111 that were in service about just a little less than a year and a half ago in the autumn, or I should say the early fourth quarter of 2022. So 777s have increased mostly, almost entirely through production, addition of production units from Boeing. And the 47 fleet, which I thought I would see more idling of, has been fairly de minimis relative given its relative importance to supply chain support. Most of those are 747-200s, the very small numbers that are still in service, but older 747-400 conversions. Now I want to talk a bit about rates. Air cargo yields are running 240 to 250 per kilogram in recent weeks. That comes to us from the good folks at World ACD. Most of this data comes to us from Boeing via their processing of cargo IS data. But I've decided to extend the time series to the first full 3 weeks of April. You can get an idea of what's going on out there. Very strong numbers. Now, does that mean margins for, excuse me, freighter operators are also running 30 to 40% higher than they were 5 years ago? The answer is no. Cost base for the average freighter operator has been analyzed by a number of consultancies and analysts out there. That the margin increase is probably somewhere in the high single digit range, somewhere between, say, 5 and 10%. So not ideal, but from an operator's perspective, but still better than it was 5 years ago. And just to give you an idea geographically of what's happening, these are trans-Pacific eastbound, that is ex-Asia, outbound Asia to U.S. destinations. I've anonymized the destinations at the request of the data supplier, Drury, but you can get an idea of the relative strength for about 7-8 markets here. And you can see the relative strength of recent pricing over pre-COVID level pricing back in 2019. But while air cargo moves, according to IATA statistics, about 60 million tons in plane per year on a global scale, the world container ship industry moves in excess of 2 billion metric tons per annum. So you get an idea of the relative strength. Shippers and supply chain managers have choice. And air cargo is often a 4-letter word, especially when you're reporting to your boss, why did you have to use air cargo? Because it's a lot more expensive based on the research we've seen over the years, anywhere between 10 and 20 times more expensive depending on relative market conditions in the trade lane. Why do people use air cargo? People think, well, it's because of speed and recovery from an unforeseen situation, but it's also reliability, and we're going to come back into that momentarily. The good folks at Drury compile basically a dollar rate per FEU. FEU is an acronym for 40-foot equivalent unit. For those of you who think in metric, think a 12-meter long box, which is the world's predominant device with which is used to move freight from point A to point B on the open ocean primarily. Those numbers I don't have numbers before the onset of the virus, but suffice it to say, they were around $1,500 US per 40-foot box you can move from East Asia to Europe or East Asia to the West Coast of the United States. Those numbers went to north of $10,000 per box during the supply chain crisis, particularly in the third quarter of 2021. And then they started to recede, and then in 2022, they dropped very quickly back to norms as the world started to fully emerge from the COVID-19 induced nightmare. And numbers are actually running in latter 2023 below pre-COVID norms, just slightly. Since then, numbers popped up to about 3,000, but are remaining relatively sticky in the $2,000 to $2,500 range. So relatively speaking, the price increase in the open ocean is much stronger than what we have seen in air. And a lot of this is due to reliability. Container ship liner company on dock reliability has dropped to less than 50%. Pre-COVID, it was running 75 to 80%. So people, I should say shippers, are buying air cargo for the reliability and the ability to sleep at night, knowing that their freight is going to arrive on time and on dock as promised. And that pricing differential between air and container ship pre-COVID was running about a multiple of 14 on average, and that was drug up to a degree by the red bars you see there during the spike at the onset of the pandemic in March, April, May of 2020, year 2020. And then that multiple dropped into the single digits in 2021 and early 2022, then surged back to, and then has fallen back in the first 3 months of this year to well below the long-term norm. And a lot of that has to do with the turmoil in the Red Sea, and to a much lesser extent, the restrictions of freight transiting the Panama Canal due to a drought in Panama and the ability of vessels to transit the Panama Canal due to low levels of water in Gatun Lake. But that's an aside. What I really want to wrap up here with is this. So cargo traffic declined 8% in 2022 and a further little less than 2% in 2023. But we've seen a year-to-year growth return in all major international markets, some stronger than others. Most trade lanes are recovering, but North America, particularly, I believe it's mostly domestic market growth, has been fairly anemic as people return to a degree to the shops and are using less e-commerce than they did during the pandemic. But what's driving the big, strong numbers in air cargo presently? Well, the continued closure of Russian and Ukrainian airspace is making sectors longer between East Asia and Europe. And because of China's backing of Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war and the closure of Russian airspace to Western powers, we're seeing a lot of extra freighter capacity needed to make up for the missing belly capacity that should be on the Transpac lane and to a lesser extent the Europe-East Asia lane. So e-commerce growth and container ship trade lane disruption are the big factors that are driving a lot of freighter usage at present. And while currently moribund, industrial production is still missing in action to a large degree. The good news is, I didn't touch on this earlier, is that a lot of forecasting authorities are seeing strengthening industrial production in the course of 2024, contingent upon, of course, the reduction in inflation. That was the big I word I hadn't brought up yet. So we need to keep an eye on that particular factor. Even with the eventual restoration of passenger networks, so freighters will continue to carry the preponderance of air cargo traffic. Yields remain 40% higher than 2019 levels, but that is still relatively de minimis compared to container ship pricing. They're still running a little less than 2x levels now relative to pre-pandemic norms. So that's all I had to share today, other than to say I'm a bit of an infomercial for those of you who may be learning or might want to learn a little more about the freighter aircraft industry. ISTAT's Freighter Forum. The second one that's ever been held will be held in Dresden, Germany, 19-20 June. I won't be there. I was at the first one because it was conveniently held here in Seattle, so my travel budget was held to a relatively small handful of Ubers, which was very convenient for me. But I urge you to think about attending. My good friends, Rob Morris from Cerium, along with Crawford Hamilton of Airbus, and my colleague from Boeing, my former colleague, will be discussing the freighter aircraft industry at length. And let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tom. That was a very interesting presentation, very intense, a lot of information in a short space of time. I have there are a few questions. Could you click away the presentation so we can see you? Yeah, there you go. Okay, so the first question is from Barbara Fitzgerald, and she's asking, on that slide you had about the stored freighter fleet, what is the age distribution of that stored fleet approximately?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I can venture a very strong guess that most of them are in excess of 25 years old. Probably closer to 30. If we're talking 747-400s that were converted, say, between 2006 and 2012, 2013, that time frame, we're talking units that were built between roughly 1988 and 1995. So you can get an idea. We're, again, 30 plus years. The MD-11 fleet, very similar.
Yeah.
So in the case of 747-200s, some of those units were built as long ago as 1985, so pushing 40 years.
So most of those aircraft are unlikely to return to service.
That's right? Correct.
Yeah. So the storage is more driven by age than by a lack of demand for those freighters, right? Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay. So Joe Hartman has a question. He just wants to know if your slides will be made available. I want to say then that this session, this learning lab, will be on YouTube probably tomorrow or maybe on Thursday. So you can view it on YouTube. I don't know. I mean, if you do you want to share the slides if people ask you, Tom?
Yeah, by all means. I believe a copy will be made available via ISTAT, if memory serves me right.
Yeah, I mean, normally the way you access this is through YouTube, and then you can just stop the video.
Yeah.
All right.
And I have to apologize very quickly, if I can interject. I was having a senior moment when I was talking about the Airbus and Boeing freighter panel to be moderated by Rob Morris of Cerium. My colleague, my former colleague at Boeing, Melanie Ray, will be talking freighters. Melanie has extensive experience supporting a number of carriers in the cargo and the freighter space for a number of years. I have to admit, I only met her briefly because of the COVID-19 lockdown in person before I left the company. So, Melanie, if you're listening today, I profusely apologize. I was blanking out. I could remember your competitor's name, but I couldn't remember yours. Back to you, Niels.
All right, that's all right. I know what you're going through. Doug Kelly has a question. What are your thoughts on the 777-300 ERSF converted freighter and the potential number you expect to be converted?
This is kind of an interesting question because I have an evolving train of thought about that particular market. And did I mention that this market has witnessed serious underinvestment for over a decade? It's of all the three freighter segments in terms of gauge, narrow body, medium, wide body, large. Large is the one that has basically experienced the biggest, I should say, neglect over the last decade. And even during the pandemic, when all of a sudden freighters became in vogue, large wide bodies could have done better. So basically, there is a demonstrated preference kind of around 75-25 for production freighter machines in the large wide body space over the last 20 years. And a number of players in the industry have taken those numbers, and these are based on Cerium fleet additions from, say, roughly year 2000 to 2020. They think that is the continued trend going forward. I'm beginning to debate that in my own mind, and let me explain. I mentioned earlier that by 2006, there were about 170 747 first generation freighters flying. Only 70 of those, roughly 72, memory serves me right, were production freighters off the Boeing production line in Everett, Washington, USA. The remaining 90 plus were conversions from either Boeing or IAI BEDEC. or a firm that is long lost to a lot of folks in this industry, GATX Airlog, which converted a substantial number of 747-100s. And so history kind of points in two different directions. More than half were conversions at one point, back in the 1990s and early 2000s, but the last 2 decades point to a preference for production machines. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say it's going to be at least probably 70-30 in terms of additions, but I could be wrong. And it all depends on the ability of the 3 firms that are pursuing PDF conversions to get their STCs and support the product in the field for their operator base. And may I point out that none of the conversion houses currently have their STCs yet.
Tom, Lucas Pavlovsky has asked a question. Sits in several parts here. He's asking if the ongoing issues with the Pratt & Whitney engine could lead to postponement of introduction of freshly converted freighters in order for, you know, the working engines to be shifted to PAC's CEO aircraft that would otherwise be parked for lack of engine.
Which Pratt engine are we talking about? On which
I think we're talking about the P2500, right?
So on the A321s, well, I will point out that I will pivot to the 737NG on that one. And anecdotally, I'm sure, Niels, we heard this at ISTAT. I heard this also in Dublin, that given the relative strength of the PAX market, you know, particularly in the narrow body sector demand space, that a number of lessors who converted 737NGs are finding it lucrative just to remove the engines from already converted 737NGs and basically release them to PAX operators to harvest the green time off them. And supposedly the lease rates on those particular motors have gone up in excess of 50% over the last 2 years. Is that going to be sustained over the long term? Probably not. Boeing and Airbus will repair their and fully deliver at some point their narrow body backlogs, but I was going to say it's going to be at least 2 to 3 years. By the way, Bob Conley, I see your question, and that I wanted to answer that in the same breath. I think we're at least probably 2026 before we see the narrow body conversion market return to some semblance of strength that would have been normal, say pre-COVID, like say in the 2016 to 2018 timeframe.
Okay. There's a question from Tyler Warner. So it reads as follows. If freighter volume does grow year over year consistently over the next 12 months, what do you see as the share of that growth across narrow body, medium wide body, and large wide bodies? Also, is there a question for younger aircraft, or can 25 plus aircraft still meet the demand?
Well, the relative shares of freighter carried traffic are roughly like this. Somewhere around 70% of freighter capacity is delivered by large wide bodies in terms of available cargo ton kilometers executed, simply because of their gauge and the long haul sectors that they serve. Medium wide bodies, probably another 10 to 15%, and then narrow bodies less than 10%. So the lion's share is on large wide bodies. And again, that is a sector that has seen woeful underinvestment for a very long time.
Just clarification on the availability of slides. So both the slides and the video will be on the ISTAT online later this week. So istat.org, right, on the website, you can look at online content and you will find the slide stack there posted. Okay. All right. And then we have a following question. Do access to parts play a role in retiring planes, for example, MD-11s, or are other issues such as efficiency a bigger driver?
Oh, absolutely. I've heard stories that the 757 fleet which is equipped only with either Pratt or Rolls engines, and a number of mRNOs that have the specialty skills to work on those engines is fairly minimal. And that's driving a lot of idle 757 capacity at present. Not to mention the relative efficiency gains you see in 737 NGs and A321 PDF conversions are starting to displace 757s, which is really sad because it's one of my favorite Boeing machines.
Okay. Tom, Joe Hartman is asking if you could be a little bit more specific on the status of the different passenger to cargo STCs in terms of status and development.
Okay, so I know all three conversion providers. I do know their relative strengths and weaknesses. I will say that the race is a lot closer than a lot of people would realize. IIBETIC was the first to announce their conversion program at CargoFax 2019 in San Diego, way back in those halcyon days of the pre-COVID era in October 2019. They are struggling to get their STC and their first aircraft redelivered. Mammoth followed, and then Kansas Modification Center NIAR joined the fray as number 3 in that space. In terms of technical risk, they all have challenges, and that's pretty much all I can say.
Okay. See if there is more questions. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. There was a couple of other questions. Well, yeah, Tom, you showed a very interesting slide on the traffic and capacity during the COVID period. But what did this do to values of dedicated freighters?
Certain cases, I think it put a supporting ledge under most freighters. But I will also say, again, when traffic, relatively speaking, started to weaken in 2022, off of a COVID-induced high that were, in terms of relative cargo traffic growth and yields that were astronomically high. Like, again, we were talking long-haul yields during off-peak season that were in excess of $6, $8, $10 per kilogram, just insane numbers. That was not going to last forever. And there were a lot of us that said that, but a lot of us just refused to believe it. And as a consequence, things did turn down. I will say that yields did not fall back to pre-COVID norms. They never got anywhere close to those. I did have several healthy debates. In some cases, I will call them arguments with folks in the field. Some of them who work for a little small cargo airline there in Luxembourg, Niels. The fuel surcharges had eradicated any sense of profitability. Fair point. Fair point. I take that. Very clear. But as always, the more efficient capacity always wins out. So the newer, more efficient machines, particularly say 777 freighters vis-a-vis MD-11s, became preferred. And that's just the way the market works, has worked since the dawn of the jet age. I mean, Niels, you and I are old enough to remember when DC-8s and 707s were in vogue. So we'll leave it at that.
But would you say that there was maybe some over conversion going on during COVID that is now leading to a hangover in terms of values? I remember I visited a conversion facility in October, and somebody told me that they actually had customers that were asking if they could do freighter to passenger conversions also.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that chuckle a few times myself. The answer is, I think there were a number of leasing companies that had idle 737 NG assets that became a little over exuberant in pursuing demand in that space without an understanding of just how volatile and how cyclical air cargo can be. And the end user demand is largely driven by for that particular gauge. Narrow bodies in general are a tool primarily of express carrier and e-commerce carriage networks. And if they're expanding in an extrinsic manner, meaning you are Amazon in 2015 and you're standing up a US domestic network in parallel to established networks by, say, FedEx and UPS that have been there for decades, then of course you need a lot of new equipment. Boom. One could argue that the e-commerce revolution that we take for granted in the developed world is only starting to develop in the developing world, and that there'll be a lot more demand. And that's where I referred to those Cerium and CH Aviation articles earlier in the presentation and discussion. That's where I'm seeing most of these new carriers. Like I've never even heard of these people, and here they are getting into the air cargo space. Now, people talk about. I've been questioned by journalists. Are you worried about, say, a return of a certain former U.S. president to the White House in November or of this year or early next year, and heightened trade wars? Well, trade always finds a way. I'm just going to leave it at that. And right now, there's a lot of Chinese money flowing into Mexico to circumvent, in my opinion, not circumvent, but get around trade flows between China and the U.S. that have been there for a long, long time, whereas the content becomes made in Mexico with a lot of Chinese capital. That is driving a lot of Chinese, I should say, Mexican air cargo traffic growth at present. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but my business partner, Frederick Horst, has written a few articles about it on our website if you're interested.
Okay, and then there's a question here. What is your take on the containerization of the A320-21 passenger to freighter in the lower deck? Do you think this is a key differentiator versus the 737?
Well, I think if I were an express or e-com carrier willing to make the investment in the container fleets as well as the handling equipment at all the stations where that equipment might fly, yes, I think it makes a difference. The flip side of that is that there was an AIAA paper published in the 2016-2017 timeframe that was published by a student that worked at Airbus in the Toulouse region, actually, of all places. And her work had discovered that less than 20% of A320s and 21s built were equipped with the Airbus containerized loading system, or CLS. Notice they call it containerized loading system. It's primarily a baggage carriage system, particularly for those countries that have stringent labor laws on airport, say in Scandinavia, Japan, Australia, just to name a few. You don't see a lot of 737, you don't see a lot of A321 operators in the low-cost carrier space. I'll pick on, say, EasyJet, EasyJet or Wizz Air in Europe. They don't use a CLS. It just adds to their system. So in a freighter space, yes, I could see where an express carrier or an e-com network provider might value it, but I would say that the preponderance of the load is going to move on the main deck.
Tom, then a final question. What is your prediction for the upcoming fight between the A350 freighter and the 777-9 freighter?
Well, I have my biases. I'll be quite honest with everybody on the call today. I'll be also a little bit selfish. Let me take the selfish answer. When I worked for a certain OEM here in the greater Seattle area, where I'm in suburban Seattle at present, it was my observation that when there's more competition, there's more traffic growth. And a lot of my cargo traffic forecasts from Boeing did not come true. I'll be quite honest with you all. But if there's more competition in terms of Keynesian market demand, Keynesian economics, lower pricing due to competition increases overall demand. Therefore, my cargo traffic forecast from your might just actually come true at some point before I leave this world. So I'm very happy for that development. it's interesting to see because Airbus has gone through a number of ups and downs in production freighter development. They were very successful with the A300-600, and I fought against that machine from my former employer a number of times, and it was tough competition. It was very tough competition in the medium wide body space relative to the 767. Then they tried to do the A380 freighter. That was wound down before the first machine was ever completely built, although there were parts fabricated for it in the 2005-2006 timeframe. Now with the 350, watch this space. Although I will point out that a number of ISTAT polls I've seen since I left Boeing tend to favor the 777-9 over the A350. So, however, in the course of 2024, Airbus has brought home some campaigns that I wasn't even aware were campaigns. So congrats to Airbus, congrats to Boeing. We'll see where this goes.
Okay, good. One more question from Amit Kumar Yadav says, so far, how many conversions done from cargo to packs for single aisle aircraft for 320s and Boeing 737 NGs?
They're in my presentation, but I think we're approaching about 200 NGs, 737 NGs that are been modified. Most of those are 800s. There's a very small handful of 737-700s. Bob, if you're on the call, I hope you're not swearing at me, but I think I got the numbers wrong, or right, more or less. A321 got a slow start, to be fair, during the pandemic, but it's interest in the machine has picked up. I want to say they're approaching about 40 converted, but they're in my table. They're in the charts, and they're in that table of year-to-date developments for the first quarter of 2024.
Okay. All right, Tom, thank you so much for that. Very interesting. And again, the slides and the video will be available on istat.org on their online tab, and also on YouTube if you want. You will have the video. And we will be back with more learning labs. Just check in on ISTAT's website for more upcoming learning labs. And with that, thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for everybody listening in, and see you back soon.